Hey youth, so I decided to dig into our Ask Anything box again, and I found another question. This one's kind of interesting. It says, what question would God ask you if you had a 30-minute conversation? This question actually got me thinking quite a bit, not so much about my interaction with God, though a little bit, and I'll answer that in a moment, but more so it got me thinking about a Bible story, specifically about Peter. So for those who aren't fully up on the Bible stories, Peter was one of Jesus' disciples. He was originally a fisherman, just an average Joe, catching fish. And Jesus calls him to be one of his disciples. Peter follows him. Peter is one of the first to call Jesus the Messiah. Peter is strong in his faith, in belief of Jesus being who he claims to be. And Peter was always the one willing to kind of go above and beyond. And on the night where Jesus was betrayed in the garden, Peter was the one who had a sword and was ready to fight to protect Jesus. However, that same night, after Jesus had been arrested, Peter was the one who, when asked if he knew who Jesus was, he denied knowing Jesus. He denied knowing Jesus 3 times. 3 times he totally backpedaled on the statements of faith he had made earlier in his ministry or in his time with Jesus. I find Peter to be quite a relatable character for a number of reasons, and one of them is because he makes such obvious human errors, and many of us can relate to that, including myself. So after Jesus' death and burial, and then later his resurrection, yes, he comes back from the dead, spoiler alert. Once he comes back from the dead, he appears to his disciples in a number of situations. He meets with a couple of disciples talking on the road to Emmaus, and he talks with them. And he meets with the disciples in the upper room and reveals himself. And, Thomas with the whole touch the holes, touch the side. But another place where he appears to them is that it seems a number of the disciples decided to go fishing one day, and Jesus shows up on the shore of the sea that they're fishing in. Jesus calls them in from the water after they've got their catch, which he helps them get through a miracle again. And as he's calling them in, Peter realizes that that's Jesus. Now remember, this is Peter who had denied Jesus 3 times right before his death. And so, there was some guilt there. I think there was some shame there. And Jesus calls them in. He makes lunch. He cooks some fish for them around a fire. And he gives each of them some lunch. And then they have a conversation, Jesus and Peter. And maybe I'll just read some of that to you. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." So remember, Peter often put himself above the other disciples, was the most fervent, was the most forward with his faith. And here Jesus says, "Do you love me more than these?" I think he means the other disciples. And Peter says, "Yes, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my lambs. Feed my lambs. Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand and someone else will lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." I think this is an interesting story and relevant to our question, because the story has Peter denying Jesus 3 times, and then in this interaction with Jesus, he's proclaiming his love for Jesus 3 times, and Jesus calls him to follow and to feed his sheep and to care for the sheep. Feed the lambs, care for the sheep. That is, the lambs and the sheep Jesus refers to are generally his people, his followers. So to come back to the answer on this, as a pastor, I think that God has entrusted me with a number of people in my life. And I mean, just as a person who follows Jesus, I think each of us are entrusted with relationships and with people that are brought into our path, that enter into our lives. And each of us is entrusted with the gospel, that is the good news of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, conquering death, and forgiveness for sin. Each of us is entrusted with that message to share and give to those who come across our path. So I think if I had a conversation with God, and the question that was asked is, what would God ask me? I think what he would ask me is, how did I do with the people he put in front of me? Did I feed the sheep? Did I care for the sheep? I think God would ask me how ministry went, how following him has gone, and whether I was able to carry the burden of the responsibility of the gospel, which isn't supposed to be too heavy, aside from it being the truth, which can be hard. And I think when God asks me that question, I'll have to honestly say that some days I really messed it up. Some days when I needed to teach, I played. Some days when I needed to be present, I was distant. Some days when I needed to pray, I made a joke. It's not always easy in the moments with people, and I don't always get it right. And I think God has entrusted people to each of us to care for one another, to be a community that supports, encourages, builds each other up, and shares the gospel, and we worship together. And that can be hard some days. And I think when I stand before God, I'll be grateful for any forgiveness and mercy he shows, for my failure to care for his sheep every day. However, that aside, there are days where I have been faithful. There have been moments of faithfulness. And right now, while we're in this time of not being together at youth nights, and not being together Sunday morning, and not being together every morning for prayer, I think that it's important that we stay connected, praying for one another, encouraging one another, sending encouraging text messages or phone calls. So in this time of being apart, let's not allow us to be too much apart. I look forward to hearing more from you. If you have any questions you'd like me to answer in a little video like this, just post them in the comments of this video, or email me, or text me, or give me a call, whatever you'd like to do. I would love to give my best answers I can for your most interesting questions. So feel free to throw questions my way. I look forward to making another video, and I look forward very much to seeing you all again soon.